per year.
Okay, I'm Marla Riekman. I'm soil management specialist with Manitoba Agriculture, and so I get the joy of working with all sorts of soil issues in Manitoba, and quite often get to come to things like this in Saskatoon for the Top Crop Manager Soil Summit. So when you're dealing with something like compaction, one of the biggest things we end up seeing is the impact of soil moisture. And so quite often people think they see these big ruts in the field after they've been traveling across the field, whether it's wet harvest or something like that, and they think, oh, I've compacted up the soil. The problem is that quite often we haven't actually compacted the soil. I guess it's not necessarily a problem, it's maybe a good thing in that case, because the compaction that's happening would require air pockets and things in the soil to actually allow the soil to be squished down. In that case, the water that's kind of filling up all of the soil spaces are keeping the soil from actually being compacted. The issue is that when our soils are moist or near field capacity, so a lot of those large pores have been allowed to basically drain out, and they're now filled with air. When we travel across the soils that are moist like that, the small pores, they stay in existence because they're filled with water, but the big pores get crushed with the weight of equipment or with the pressure of tires or tracks going across the field. So if you're dealing with trying to manage something like compaction, unfortunately, the management becomes a bit complicated because a lot of times you have to do things, sometimes on the fly, that take time or aren't always the easiest things to manage within our kind of field operations. So number one thing, you want to make sure that your tires are run at their rated pressure. So if you have tracks, that is already set at whatever pressure, you can't change that. But with tires, if your tires are overinflated, it means pushing more of that pressure down, and it kind of is over a smaller space or smaller area of the field, and you get more pressure pushed down, more impact, more compaction. So if you have your tires run at rated pressure so that they kind of spread out more, then you actually decrease the total pressure that's being put on the soil from the tire. So that would be one thing that you can do, is to maintain that tire pressure to the rated kind of field levels. Second thing you want to do is decrease the weight of equipment if you can. So as we get higher axle load or higher weights of equipment across that axle, not only does you have the tire pressure that's causing that kind of compaction under the tire, but then the weight of the equipment pushes even deeper down into the soil. And so you end up with deeper soil compaction from that equipment weight. And so you want to decrease the weight of equipment, which isn't always easy to do when we're talking about bigger and bigger grain carts and stuff during harvest. That weighs a lot. And so if you have multiple axles, that kind of takes away some of the load, which is beneficial. Or running equipment at half full, running your grain carts half full. It's not something everyone wants to do, but if it's in a risky situation where you have moist soils, that might be kind of an approach that you may want to take. The third thing that you can do is, if you're dealing with going across the field during a moist or kind of wet-ish but not super wet fall condition, you want to actually look at traveling across the field in the same spot. So they say that 80% of compaction happens the first time you've gone over the field. And if you're going over the field multiple times, you might as well just stay on the same track as much as you can. So if the grain cart is going out to meet with the combine, rather than coming in from the approach and just driving across the field, maybe you can take a very specific path that you're constantly going out on. And then from that point, you might go out and meet the combine, but potentially you can decrease some of the overall effect of traveling across that field because you just don't have as much of a footprint across the entire field in that case. So when you're dealing with something like salinity, the problem with this is it's all about water. So your water table is coming up to the surface, and as water is coming up, then the capillary rise draws the water even higher, and then you get salts coming up to that surface. Evaporation from the surface leaves, salts behind. The water leaves to the atmosphere, but the salts are left behind. And so when you're talking about something like salinity, you don't want to manage anything but your water table. That is kind of the biggest take home that you can deal with salinity, is all about managing the depth of your water table. So sometimes, again, we can't always easily deal with that. If you can do things like drainage or artificially lower the water table through something like tile, that may be a way to kind of decrease decrease the water table and allow more salts to kind of transfer down or leach down and out that tile. Tile drainage depends on what province you're in. There might be restrictions on whether or not you actually can drain, so it might be a harder thing to deal with. But one thing you can do is try to use higher water using crops in your rotation to suck up more moisture in those years. Or where you have higher risk of salinity, maybe shying away from really saline sensitive crops in the rotation like soybeans or corn, and sticking to your small grains and oil seeds that might have more capacity to kind of survive through those saline kind of times. Because again, salinity comes and goes. It's when you monitor for it or you test for it, you always want to be testing for it year after year after year to see how it changes, because it's always going to kind of ebb and flow with the high and low kind of moisture situations, depending on how much rainfall we have and how high that water table comes up. So we do need to monitor it over time and then make decisions where we can to kind of try to use crops to our advantage. If you're trying to kind of deal with this issue of wet and dry, the biggest thing is remembering that we don't have control over the weather. We can't actually make a decision on whether or not we get this much rain or that much rain unless we're under irrigation, of course. It's the one time that we actually have some level of control over it. But if we can't control this on our own, we can plan for the future and can plan for the understanding that we have high moisture and we have low moisture and we're dealing with these ups and downs. So if you're dealing with high risk for compaction, making some of those simple changes during, say, if it's harvest that you've got a problem, checking your tire pressure, making sure everything's running as optimally as you can, making those decisions on how you're going to travel across the field, being more deliberate in planning for field traffic. And if you're dealing with salinity, sometimes, again, it's remembering that there isn't a quick fix. It is a long-term thing. It is a lot of planning. And we can plan for it to some degree. These aren't easy things to deal with, but really it's taking a look at your cropping system as a whole and making decisions on whether you can actually make some changes here and there. It might be small incremental changes, something as simple as planting a row of alfalfa along the edge of a field to decrease something like roadside salinity. That's a simple thing that could be done, and that might be enough for you in order to kind of minimize or mitigate some of those issues.